This looks like being a bit of a long video if my notes are anything to go by, so here's a brief summary. Starting with the most important bit, don't forget to like and share the video. This one actually might be worth liking and sharing for once. To continue, health chiefs are now acknowledging that current excess deaths and possibly large numbers of future excess deaths are the consequences of lockdowns, something which they did know at the time and which was actually published at the time. They are also saying now that reduced immunity in the community is probably also down to lockdowns, and that this is resulting in a number of deaths currently, and that's a situation which they say will probably get worse. And also a reminder of what the Bank of England said about the financial Armageddon of lockdown coming from the highest possible authority, the Bank of England, and then a little bit of World Economic Forum stuff towards the end. The NHS is almost invariably operating at peak capacity. This was from spring 2019. Home in there to total and general and acute, occupancy ranges between 80 and 90%, and that's not the peak time of year. Go to winter time and occupancy is higher again and even gets up to 100% in one hospital. Consistently almost at full capacity. Funnily enough, this all radically changed a year later. This is the same quarter as the one you just saw, total and general and acute. Capacity a good 30% lower, 50, 60, 70%. Amazing difference. There is a reason all those beds were unoccupied. There were no nurses to attend to them, they were all outside in the corridor. Some of this is them just randomly jumping around like morons, but some of it is, by nurse standards, clearly prepared and practiced. They didn't just put on silly party wigs and whatnot and start jumping up and down. Someone took the time to choreograph a fair few of these routines, and then they'd all have to even bring in party wigs in some cases, learn the routines, practice them, and then record and upload them to TikTok, where they never really expected anyone to actually see them. And while all this was happening, or not happening as the case may be, you were, on the other hand, clapping them. This is not unreasonable, since some of those routines were clearly choreographed and practiced and probably did deserve some sort of recognition. But of course, you weren't clapping them for their embarrassing dance routines. You were clapping them because you thought they were all collapsing under the strain of work during the deadly plague. Turns out this wasn't strictly accurate. But there were consequences for hospitals emptying and partying nurses because the country hadn't suddenly gone immune to cancer and such diseases, they simply weren't showing up for treatment. Extreme heart care disruption linked to 30,000 excess deaths involving heart disease. Severe ambulance delays, inaccessible care and ever-growing waiting lists are contributing to heart patients dying needlessly, our new analysis warns. Since that is the British Heart Foundation and therefore reliable, it's probably redundant, although still interesting, that Quasimodo and his sidekick were saying something very similar recently. Chris Whitty warns of high death rates due to COVID delays. Chief Medical Officer and Patrick Vallance say significant numbers could die of heart disease and cancer because of the pandemic. Actually, the response to the pandemic, to be precise. None of those things listed in the British Heart Foundation headline relate to the infectious disease COVID-19. They relate to the government response to it. That is not a semantic clarification. Oh, they're one and the same thing. No, they are not. Waiting list meltdowns, etc., are not the consequence, by definition, of an infectious disease. They are the consequence of the government response to it. This is false, and this is correct. Britain is in for a prolonged period of high death rates because people stayed away from the NHS during the pandemic or could not get treatment, the Chief Medical Officer for England has warned. Sir Chris Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Officer to the government, acknowledged that pleas to protect the NHS combined with the pressure of treating COVID were likely to lead to significant numbers dying of conditions such as heart disease and cancer in the coming months and years. What they are talking about is what is currently around a total of 30,000 excess deaths without COVID as the underlying cause, and about which they were more forthcoming in private, according to the current Prime Minister in July this year. Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Advisor, would openly admit that lockdowns could do more harm than good. That being the case, and there currently being around 180,000 deaths since early 2020 due to COVID, when you rejig the figures to include the whole UK and not just England and Wales here. And yes, I am choosing my words precisely here, due to COVID and not with COVID. The attending doctors, not the PCR tests, the attending doctors who signed off on those deaths as due to COVID were not robots programmed by Bill Gates, master criminal. I have to say that every time this comes up, because there is still a no, it's all a hoax crowd out there. You would have to then assume that they, Vallance and Whitty, envisage potentially more lockdown deaths than those approximately 180,000 or so due to COVID. They did say possibly more harm than good. And back in 2020, at the start of all this same message was being actually reported in public. As published in The Spectator, Whitty and co. were looking at models which predicted 150,000 avoidable deaths caused by lockdown. So the mayhem and destruction were actually well anticipated. The stock response with which they will probably try to sell the next one is the apparently rather conveniently unfalsifiable, "Oh, but it would have been so much worse without the lockdowns." Well, worse than 150,000 unavoidable deaths, that seems unlikely. But the answer to that, the conveniently apparently unfalsifiable statement, is to falsify it by looking elsewhere in the world, like Japan, still wrapped up in face masks, exercising indoors here and outside. Not the same adherence as previously, but still pretty much ubiquitous use. This is a webcam from a few days ago in Tokyo. Switch to the data for mask-free UK, mask-free from that point there, and the mask period being that one, ironically since it contains the biggest wave of COVID deaths we had, but after that point all good. Then to the data for the slave race Japanese, still wrapped up in their beloved masks. Wow, look at that heretic there! That's Japan's COVID deaths from this year. They've had two big waves, much bigger than anything previously, and you can see they've just started on a third one. And if you put us and them side by side, or one above the other, and observe that that is the one and that is the other, I don't think the "oh, it would have been so much worse" claim appears much borne out from looking at this evidence, nor any other from around the world when you compare outcomes based on lockdown here, mask there, no lockdown here, no mask there. So a potential shed-load of horror coming down the track, according to Whitty and Vallance, for which the NHS is now preparing, because apparently the NHS is creating a 1.3 billion pot for COVID compensation claims. The effects of delayed diagnoses and treatment during the pandemic are evident now in the number of deaths from cancer and heart disease. Notice that they correctly say during the pandemic and not because of the pandemic on this occasion, so they got that right here. So this notorious propaganda from back then was at least partially true. Remember that? The middle bit is definitely correct. The NHS was soundly protected because hardly anybody was using it, as we saw from those bed occupancy numbers. That bit there, not exactly. Maybe replace that with that. There wasn't a whole lot of love involved either. Those dancing nurses were tenderly giving the middle finger, and quite a few more besides, to the patients who should have been in hospital but were staying away to protect the NHS. It was partially correct. It did protect the NHS. To date, approximately 30,000 acknowledged excess deaths of lockdown consequences, which they're now saying is pretty much set fair for some time to come, and which is entirely consistent with what was being projected at the start of it all. And although that projected 150,000 back then all looked a little bit vague and hypothetical. It looks a lot more potentially real now that we've got approximately 30,000 already in the bag, so to speak. But it gets better. Lockdowns to blame for strep A that's killed 4 children. Strep A is apparently a bacteria which causes certain diseases. How could staying at home possibly cause this? Health experts have suggested that COVID-19 lockdowns may have laid the groundwork for a rise in strep A. Scientists have long held worries about what impact 2 years of lockdowns may have had on people's immune systems. The common cold for a time didn't feel that common, hence why health officials are a little more worried than usual about the flu season this winter. And strep A might be the same, as youngsters were not exposed to the kind of routine bugs they usually would have been if in school, making them more susceptible than other kids have in the past. Dr. Simon Clark, a microbiologist at the University of Reading, told Mail Online, "You'll be aware of lockdowns having an effect on immunity for things like flu. The principle is the same. A lack of mixing in kids may have caused a drop in population-wide immunity that could increase transmission in that age group. I do expect there to be further cases over the coming weeks and probably months." I made a video about exactly this subject 2 years ago, and it got deleted because I included a clip from an American doctor who was saying exactly this, exactly the same as what they are saying now about risks to immunity, and that video was deleted internet-wide. Obviously I can't include the clip here, but I've put it on Twitter and I've put the link to that clip in the description box under this video. I've put it on Getter as well. Take a look at the clip, share it, that would probably be a good idea. People should be reminded that this everyday science was being suppressed 2 years ago. What he was saying back then is exactly what they're saying now. This different report in the Mail: infectious disease specialists today warned that lockdowns may be to blame for the surge in cases, with young children shuttered away during the pandemic having less immunity towards the routine bug. I will say again, this is exactly what that doctor was saying back then. And back then, all mention of him was expunged from mainstream social media. I am happy in my small way to have helped rehabilitate his words with that video clip. I also put in a link to the full hour-long video, which is on my now unused BitChute, in the replies, if you want to see it. None of which even considers what Mervyn King of the Bank of England said about lockdown economic disaster.
All central banks in the West, interestingly, made the same mistake. And during COVID, when the economy was actually contracting because of lockdown, central banks decided it was a good time to print a lot of money. That was a mistake. That led to inflation. We had too much money chasing too few goods, and the result was inflation. That was predictable, it was predicted, and it happened.
The link to that full clip is also in the description. People were saying that 2 years ago and more. Admittedly, the following video came out, again, 2 years ago, so I could give them the benefit of the doubt and speculate that they might have changed their minds, but I somehow doubt it. The World Economic Forum put out this video in praise of lockdowns, and if you haven't seen it, it's 55 seconds worth sticking around for. And if you have seen it, it's 55 seconds worth sticking around for. Earthquakes were cured and cities went silent. Pollution and carbon emissions were down and the skies were clear. Granted, you've got no money, your aunt committed suicide, your best friend died of an undiagnosed heart condition, one of your children ended up in a mental institution, and the other one is now so debilitated that they've got scarlet fever. But hey, clear skies. And I doubt very much that they have been now weaned off that lockdown love affair, so I suspect they will ultimately push for more such. So here is a summary to date. Excess deaths caused by lockdown are being acknowledged by UK public health officials and were predicted at the time. Decreased immunity caused by lockdown is being acknowledged by scientists as being the reason for increased disease susceptibility in children. The inflationary disaster caused by lockdown is recognised at the highest level of the finance industry. And here's the kicker. The Chinese were pushing for more. This was back at the start. China-style quarantine of the healthy, please. That'll finish those Westerners off once and for all. That was this bloke here, Dr. Zhongyi. Definitely put your life in his hands, right? He was pushing the West for China-style lockdowns. Coming to a town near you at some potential future point if you allow it. If you allow it, economic devastation, health devastation, everything devastation, but get those blue skies. Those blue skies were definitely something worth having.